Australia's worsening economic horror nightmare. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
We're not talking about silver tonight.
No, we're not talking about silver. We're actually talking about, a very significant event milestone that's happened in Australia in the last week, and that is the end of the COVID-19 stimulus. Quite a few factors have come together that would, for a lot of Australians, seem like a horror story all coming at once. We had our differences of opinion about COVID-19 last year, but I do believe that the past week is the consequence of overreacting to the virus. So the overreaction to the virus led to the biggest stimulus package in Australian history because they had to protect the debt bubble, and now a number of those supports have been taken away. So what I thought would be important to highlight to the audience is, what was done in terms of the policies. What's our views about the macroeconomic impact? Because I've had a range of emails, and I was in Adelaide in the past few days and meeting a number of our viewers, and a lot of people are asking, well, what's the macroeconomic outlook for the next 12 months? So everyone's very fascinated about that, particularly given a number of these changes. What are the implications both in terms of public policy and in terms of politics? So I think there's a lot to get into, and for a lot of Australians, I think they're very keen to get a feel for where this economy is going to go for the next 12 months.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying, John, that whilst there's a lot of things all happening at the end of March, right, the consequences and implications might not all manifest themselves tomorrow afternoon. It might take some time to work through, right? So this is a question of what is the trajectory of the economy going to be like, not just over the next couple of weeks, but over the next 6 to 12 months.
Indeed. Now, one of the key things before we get into some of the detail is that when we were preparing for the show, one of the things you observed was that there's about a third of Australians already struggling even before these changes.
Yep.
And one may say that these changes are actually going to exacerbate that third cohort of Australians that are suffering, and it will start to flow into the economic conditions of the other two-thirds of Australians. Now, in terms of the whether we're going to see a deflationary depression or a cliff or something of that nature, I think you just touched on that, which is there were fears of a cliff, and there was going to be a sharp rise in unemployment and insolvencies. So there will be, but perhaps not as much as what people initially anticipated. But obviously there's the Treasurer has already come out on the public record and saying that he, in the upcoming budget, is hoping to bring forward $12 billion worth of tax cuts, and he hopes that's going to offset some of the impacts of the decisions of the last week and a half.
Yeah, those tax cuts won't happen till 2024, right? Well, they might bring them forward, but at the moment that they're out into the future. We also know, of course, that the Reserve Bank will go on doing QE. The term funding facility goes on till June. My expectation is the Reserve Bank will still go on doing quantitative easing until the second half of the year. So there are other things going on in terms of sort of supporting the economy, but the fiscal stuff is definitely changing.
Yes. So Martin, why don't we actually quickly just go through what were the key changes in the last week and a half? So we saw the end of JobKeeper, and that was support for businesses to keep people employed. We see an end to JobSeeker, and that was an initial $550 boost to unemployment insurance. And we'll quickly touch on that in a second. We see the ending of Home Builder, and Home Builder was a subsidy for new construction or major renovations. We see the ending of the National Eviction Moratorium. So this was the agreement of National Cabinet to keep people in their houses or in their rental properties during the pandemic. And one thing I should say is that I'm already hearing reports in Perth of significant numbers of people being evicted. Yep. Because they were severely behind in rent. and for a number of these people, there is nowhere for them to go in terms of alternative accommodation. We also see actually an interesting in Western Australia is they've ended the moratorium on rental increases. So they paused and said, if you're a landlord, you can't increase the rent. Now they've removed that, and I do know that a number of landlords are increasing rent in WA quite significantly to catch up with where the market should be, in their view. And obviously we've seen an ending of the bank repayment holidays. It's fair to say, Martin, that the banks have over the last few months been winding that cohort down and down and down.
Yes.
And the last remaining cohort that were not paying their mortgage now have to pay their mortgage. Particularly for those who are caught up with either job losses or income reductions, how they meet those repayments going forward. And obviously, if you did get a holiday, that additional capital or repayment that you didn't pay will have to be made up in one form or another.
Yeah, and there's one more I'll just add, and that is that the rentals for commercial property, which also had some, work out and local agreement between you and the landlord, etc. But you can't just be kicked out. Well, that's also gone too. So the commercial sector has the same rental issues as the retail sector.
Yeah. Now, so what I want to do is just go very quickly through Keeper and Seeker.
Yep.
So with JobKeeper, just to remind our audience, so when the pandemic first started in March of 2020, there was a $1,500 a fortnight payment to keep people in work. By September, it was extended, but it was introduced into a two-tier system. So if you were working more than 20 hours a week, you were getting $1,200 a fortnight as opposed to $1,500. But if you were working less than 20 hours a week, it was $750 a fortnight. And then that was extended to the January of this year. And then since the start of the year, JobKeeper again went into a third phase where if you were working more than 20 hours a week, you were getting $1,000 a fortnight. And if you were less than 20 hours a week, you were only getting $650. So those supports have now ended, and a lot of people will be losing their jobs. And we'll quickly go into the estimates soon on that. Now, Seeker is, the job seeker issue is, I think, very important because there is some evidence that quite a number of Australians are quite confused about what the policy is. So again, initially it was a $550 increase in unemployment insurance. Then in late last year, they reduced that from $550 down to $150, and now JobSeeker has now ended. Now there have been calls by a whole host of stakeholders across the country that the level of unemployment insurance pre-COVID-19 was way too low. So what the Morrison government have decided is that starting on the 1st of April, which we're already past, is that the level of unemployment insurance will increase by $50 a fortnight. And that will basically take unemployment insurance from about, I think, $565.70 up to $615.70 per fortnight. So, given all the inflation that we're talking about in terms of rents, in terms of food, in terms of all these other cost of living pressures, $600 a fortnight with a situation of increasing unemployment and underemployment, which we're going to see, if you are struggling to find work or the right type of work or enough work, it is going to be a very significantly harsh and severe period over the next 2 or 3 months, if not 6 months. And one of the key points I would say on this, Martin, is that Yahoo Finance recently did an article, and they, according to one survey, up to 29% of Australians believe that JobSeeker was actually going up as opposed to going down. So perhaps there will be a cohort of Australians who are going to be shocked, thinking that their income will increase starting 1 April, but no, their income as an unemployed person will go down. So if anyone watching this show is unemployed and they were slightly confused about that policy, I think it's very important that just in terms of your own financial planning, that you whether you can take our word or independently check as to what your entitlement's going to be, particularly over the next couple of months.
Yeah, and just to add, they also added some additional hurdles, right? So there's a bigger requirement now to show that you're actually applying for jobs. There's also a Dobbin Line, which they've introduced. So in other words, if you are offered jobs but you turn them down, that prospective employer can actually dob you in, and that could actually lead to you getting nothing, right? And some other things too. So the government's really turned the screws up in terms of trying to get people to go get a job, right? But the net is absolutely quite right. It's lower than it was before, simply because of the fact that the COVID element has gone completely. And whilst there's a small increase, the net position will be lower than beforehand.
Correct. Now, in terms of home builder, just to recap, it was a $25,000 subsidy for new building or new major renovations. In November of last year, that was reduced to $15,000, and the eligibility was widened.
Yep.
And now that obviously comes to an end, and that was actually instrumental around keeping people in the trades employed.
Yeah, and that's had a huge impact on two fronts. Firstly, everyone is now rushing to try and start the building because they've got to start it within a certain window, right?
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, there's an absolute run on building resources.
Yes.
So a lot of the projects that might get started will just sit there doing nothing for months and months and months because they won't be able to get resources, nor indeed the construction materials to be able to complete them. So this has completely messed up the supply chain and messed up the flows. This is a stupid policy. It should never have gone in, but of course it was all about saving the construction sector.
Indeed. Martin, before we move on, one question for you is that because there have been because this policy has led to a run on the materials and I think I read something the other day about shortage of timber.
Yep.
But also because tradies are actually overworked or have too much work at the moment, given all this activity. I'm assuming that in and of itself is going to lead to price rises, and that's actually going to offset the subsidy.
Well, there's no doubt that people are finding that the quotations that they were given for work are now being inflated. Absolutely. Both in terms of the cost, but also the time.
Yes.
So those two factors mean that people are going to be surprised, I think, that it's going to take a lot longer and it's going to cost a lot more.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the macroeconomic impact, in February we did a show, and actually going back last year, I said we're going to have stagflation,
yep,
which is again low economic growth, elevated unemployment, and rising prices. We did a show in February on this channel, and I said that given the Biden stimulus package going forward, which was the $1.9 trillion stimulus package, which has already been implemented, now he's announced, just over a $2 trillion infrastructure package, and I dare say there'll be more spending coming forward from Biden. So I think the global picture is more economic stimulus going forward, particularly out of the United States. Now, some may say that one may expect to see deflation coming from the withdrawal from these stimulus measures related to COVID-19. Probably a couple of points I'll make. So I do think that we are going to see stagflation continue. So my position on stagflation hasn't changed, and so we will definitely see unemployment rise and the estimate. So what we know is that as of March 2021, about still 1.1 million Australians were on JobKeeper. Now, how many jobs will be destroyed because of Keeper ending? The estimates range from about 100,000 to 250,000 jobs. That they are people who will find no work as a result of the policy being withdrawn. Now, the other thing I dare say is we're going to see a very sharp rise around underemployment, and underemployment means that you can't get enough work that you're willing to work, and obviously that won't be captured in the unemployment statistics. So unemployment now is 5.8. We're going to see unemployment go back above 6%. But if you're underemployed, you still won't be included in the unemployment statistic, but your income is going to fall potentially quite sharply, and that fall of income is going to have a huge impact in your ability to meet your existing cash flow obligations, whether it's debt or whether it's rent or whether it is the sort of all the necessities of life.
Yeah, and if you look at Roy Morgan's alternative measures of employment and underemployment, they would say that around 20% of the population currently is either unemployed or underemployed. They use a different set of definitions, right? So we know that there are a substantial number of people who are not getting the incomes that they need or want, right? And the chances are that number's going to go up, not down. So this is a very significant factor. And I think that whilst there are some who have done quite well, there are a lot of people who won't have done pretty well and will be struggling now ahead.
Yes. So one of the things you were telling me before we started recording was that pre these decisions, we had a third that was doing super well in this economy.
Yep.
We had a third that was doing okay, but they were sort of not in dire straits, and a third are basically in financial distress. And obviously we've seen a lot of activity in the housing market because of all this ultra loose policy. Now it's interesting, I had a real estate agent call me here in the Illawarra in the last few days, and I had the chance to get his observations. So he's seeing a boom in Wollongong houses and right across the Illawarra. He says it's a function of the ultra low interest rates, but also it's probably the fact that you've raised in the past, which is people are making a very short-term cash flow decision. Can I afford the property now or the repayment? Not necessarily whether I can pay with changing circumstances. But the other thing that was seen or observed here in the Illawarra, and I'm sure you may all have a comment about this, is there's limited housing stock.
Yep.
So apartments are in abundance, and there is an issue with the apartment market and prices. But in terms of houses, a lot of people chasing a smaller amount of stock, and that's why prices are going quite through the roof. And it is interesting. This morning I had a phone call with a mate of mine who's a mortgage broker in Sydney, and he is saying that he's doing some of the best numbers as a mortgage broker in his career. And one of the observations he made, I thought which was quite interesting, is prospective borrowers are calling him up and asking, how much can I borrow? And when he puts it through the calculator, the financial calculator, he gives them a number which is more than what they thought they could borrow.
Yep.
And then they say, well, how much are my repayments? The repayments are lower than what they anticipate. And so it would seem to me that as Australians are going to banks or mortgage brokers and saying, I'm interested, particularly if you're, first home buyers is one cohort that are active, but also people looking to upgrade their property. If you are willing to take on more debt, the message I'm hearing, and I'm happy for you to disagree with me, Martin, is people are going to financial institutions and they're being told you can take on a lot more debt than what you think you can. And a lot of people are actually taking that offer up because they think they can afford the repayment today. And that is a big factor as to why we're seeing this short-term buoyancy in the market. But in that buoyancy, we're just seeing households drowning in ever more debt. That if ever income was to reduce or interest rates were to rise, the ability to service these high 6-figure, 7-figure mortgages, it's going to be extremely hard for these new borrowers to actually service.
Yeah, so two things have happened. Firstly, of course, rates have come down, and that is also reflected in the lower hurdle rates that APRA imposes on the banks now. So the banks have taken that on board. So the multiples, the sort of income multiples I'm seeing now, are regularly 6, 7 and 8 times income, which is huge, right? The second is that as a result of that, with the interest rates down and the income multiples up, the borrowing power of people have moved up by somewhere between 15 and 20% from where it was just a year, 18 months ago, right? And remember that this is with responsible lending obligations on the lenders still there.
Yes.
Right? So YM would want to argue for the removal of responsible lending. That's a whole different issue, but it's an important one. So people are getting bigger mortgages, right? And they're also getting bigger mortgages if they're doing the upsizing, right? Because they can borrow more and at cheaper rates. But as you say, there's no wriggle room, right? If you look at the average repayments that people are making, they're roughly similar to where they were previously. It's just that they've now got a bigger loan on top of it. That means that if rates do move up, and some people are thinking rates might move up sooner than perhaps others are thinking, like the Reserve Bank, that could be a problem. Or more importantly, what happens if the income shock that some people are going to experience does come through?
Yes.
So we are building huge risks. And interestingly, the APRA statistics, which came out quite recently, showed a higher proportion of high loan-to-value loans than previously, right? More interest-only loans than previously. So in other words, the risk parameters, whether you look at income multiples, whether you look at the total amount of repayments, or indeed loan-to-value ratios, they're all going the same way. Risk is on.
Yes. And you know, when you are an elite member of this country, and you are basically at risk of losing everything. And what I mean by that is that if the housing household debt bubble, and the housing market, if that was to go in a deflationary crash, politicians lose their jobs, banks lose their careers, banks may not even survive, and obviously public officials like the RBA and APRA, I mean, their careers are basically toast. So when you are desperate to keep the show on the road, you are willing to do things of a more riskier nature, and dare I say, I think we're seeing that. Now,
And John, just one thing to say, APRA came out this last week and said, we've got no responsibility for house prices. It's not our job, right? All we are worried about is the financial stability of the financial system, right? We don't look at individual loans. We don't look at individual transactions at all. We rely on the banks and their risk management processes. And we ask them questions about whether they've got risk management processes in train. So APRA is asleep at the wheel with regard to these risks. The Reserve Bank has said, we're not going to do it at the moment. We are a bit sort of worried about what may happen, but we're not really worried about it. But I would say, look at New Zealand. New Zealand, a couple of weeks ago, had to tighten the screws dramatically because they were seeing home prices in New Zealand going more than 20% higher over the year. And so they reduced the loan-to-income ratios, they reduced the amount of investment lending that can be done to try and control it, right? And yet we're doing nothing here at the moment. We're stoking the fire rather than actually trying to cool it a little bit. So we've got a real issue boiling, I think, here.
Look, a very interesting observation, Martin. I mean, the point I think you're raising is that in the federal bureaucracy, there is no one responsible for what I would call macroeconomic systemic risk.
No.
And I've long thought that should actually be a role for the RBA, and I wouldn't mind actually changing the RBA Act to actually put, because they say it's about full employment, low inflation, and the welfare of the Australian people is their mandate. How about macro systemic risk in there as well? And maybe we wouldn't have such ridiculously low interest rates.
Well, it's interesting because in New Zealand, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand now has to consider home prices in their macro policies. So the monetary policy has to actually specifically think about the impact on home prices. That's changed quite recently.
It has been long observed over the last 2 or 3 decades that New Zealanders are more forward-thinking than in terms of Australians.
I think that's proved again. Yeah, absolutely proved again.
Indeed. Now we've talked about the household sector now, but when we look at businesses, so it's hard to be precise. Now, I think I saw just before I came over to your house today that in December, still about 500,000 businesses were receiving JobKeeper numbers. Now, there are estimates that maybe 5,000 businesses will go under as a result of this policy. We are likely to see a number of businesses go under in the immediate term, and a lot of these zombie businesses which have failing business models. But those that think they can survive as we go forward, and as conditions worsen as these policies start to take effect, noting that it's going to take 2 or 3 up to 6 months for the full effect to occur. We're going to see the number of insolvencies progressively go up over the next 6 months. So what is the final number of businesses, whether the SMEs or large corporates, that are not going to survive? We'll have to see, but at least 5,000 businesses across the country, but dare I say it could be even higher.
Yeah, well, my surveys of, there's around 2 million small and medium enterprises in Australia. I think about 20% of them are sailing very close to the wind at the moment. Some of them will not be able to continue trading for that long at all. Many others will hang on by their fingernails and hope to see a change in the weather, as it were. But there's no doubt that JobKeeper was an important element in keeping those businesses afloat. That's now being removed. And that's particularly true of the tourism sector, because international borders are shut. There are people in the education sector that are being impacted. The retail sector is also quite wobbly. The latest retail numbers were down compared with previously. So that there are pockets where things aren't too bad, but there are also pockets where things are actually pretty shocking. And of course, we still have these little lockdowns, like we had, 3 days in Brisbane, right?
Yes.
Well, if those things continue, that's just going to put more downward pressure on a lot of these small businesses, and eventually they're going to say, "I give up."
Indeed. Now, when we've started this section of the program, we talked about stagflation. So we've talked about how we're expecting to see unemployment to go up and businesses fail. And obviously what that will mean is that this will be a drag on economic growth.
Yep.
Now, in terms of prices, I see no evidence that prices are falling across the economy. So obviously we now see the ability for rent to go up, house prices are going up, and in terms of food, so it's interesting. I'm just the anecdotal stories I'm hearing about what is the cost to go to the supermarket, what's the cost to go out to eat, etc. You may laugh at this, Martin, but when I was in Adelaide in the last few days, I went on Rundle Street, which is one of the main streets in the CBD, and I went past a cafe and had a bit of a look inside, and they were selling a ordinary croissant. Not like of a regular size, so nothing big or nothing fancy, with ham, cheese, and tomato for $8. Now, perhaps I'm more too accustomed to Wollongong prices, but $8 for a normal croissant seemed quite exorbitant. And now, because I don't have debt and you don't have debt, our ability to pay that sort of price may be okay. But to the Australian that is in insecure work, maybe single. And obviously, trying to trying to pay rent and trying to pay all those typical bills, and then you're seeing sort of expensive food prices, whether at the supermarket or at cafes. When I talk about, actually, I want to make 2 points here. So when I've talked about Armageddon happening, and I had my 6 scenario model, 3 were deflation, and when deflation happens, like a 50% crash in the stock market, you can see it. But when it's stagflation, these things take time and they creep up on you. And the problem, I think, for Australians is we have a government and a reserve bank that says inflation is low, and we also have a consumer price index which has been manipulated to the extent that it's underreporting what real inflation is. So people think that there's no inflation, but then it takes some time for people to wake up. And I've noticed in some recent conversations I've had with people personally that people are starting to make these, trying to make these observations of it's more expensive to rent, or it's more expensive to service your car, or to send your child to childcare, or to go out and eat, etc. So there is a cohort of Australians who are doing reasonably well, that they can absorb these higher prices. But I think for the average middle class family, or those who are in financial distress, these anecdotal examples of slow creeping inflation that's not being acknowledged by the CPI, that is really having a significant impact on living standards. And dare I say, with all the stimulus that has happened around the world, and obviously we're seeing more stimulus from the RBA, I think that phenomenon is going to continue over the next 12 months.
So let me make one point here, John, and that is that in my surveys, we've got a lot of stress. More than 40% of households are in financial stress, right? That's a cash flow, right? And a lot of it's to do with those costs that we're talking about. Right? The costs are actually crunching a lot of people, right? No income growth, costs rising, nowhere to go, right? And that's true whether you're actually a mortgage holder, or whether you're actually renting, or whether you're actually home free. And the problem that I see is that with rates being so low and everything else going on, you would expect stress to be dropping, but it's not. And my view is it's going to rise ahead.
Indeed. Now, in terms of the economy fully opening up, so we've seen what I would call a partial opening up on the domestic scene, but in terms of fully engaging with the global economy, the policymakers, their view is that full international travel both ways can only happen with massive rollouts of vaccines and these vaccine passports, which I personally oppose.
Yes.
So it is interesting that that there was, I think, I saw this morning in the press 7 patients dying from one of these vaccines in the UK, and now that's and obviously due to blood clots. And I mean, look, I have to say, Martin, it's a very funny phenomenon in this country that when something happens on continental Europe, we tend to ignore it. But when it happens in the United Kingdom, if it's exactly the same thing, we tend to take notice. Yep. So I'm not sure why that is, but obviously there are problems with the rollout of the vaccine, and that means that there will be a delay in fully re-engaging with the global economy, and that's obviously going to be a drag on economic growth over this interim period.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the ABC's Norman Swan, who I think has actually got his finger on the pulse on this yesterday, said that in his view, the rollout should be paused here while we actually sort out this issue, because it's a real issue, right? So not just basically saying, oh no, it's fine, carry on. There is an issue here. And it's interesting when somebody like that actually publicly says, time to pause, I think we should take notice.
Well, I mean, the thing is, look, I think we should pause when common sense dictates it, not when someone prominent on the ABC says it. But obviously, I take the point. Now, we've talked about, Martin, a lot of stimulus being removed.
Yep.
So it is important to just note that there is some additional stimulus coming.
Yep.
Now, what the Morrison government has tried to do is acknowledge that certain sectors of the economy are disproportionately impacted by the removal of these policies that we've gone through in today's show. So 2 weeks ago, they announced a $135 million package for the arts and entertainment sector, because obviously large-scale events are still limited in Australia.
Yep.
So there's a bit of support for that sector. And obviously there's this question of there are legislated tax cuts. So there was a 3-phase tax plan that the Morrison government put forward a couple of years ago. Last year in 2020, stages 1 and 2 were implemented. Stage 3 is due to start on the 1st of July 2024, and Frydenberg is seeking in the upcoming budget to bring that forward for 2021. So the tax cuts are about $12 billion, and the hope is that tax cut, that large $12 billion tax cut this year, will offset the impact of JobKeeper going away. Now, we'll have to see if that passes Parliament. But one thing I will say is that the nature of these third round tax cuts are actually for, from memory, people in the upper income band. Now, that will have some assistance on mortgage stress, because the bulk of the debt is held by the upper end of the income scale. So if they're getting a tax cut, that's going to provide some income relief. But in terms of the 1/3 of Australians in distress, and these are typically middle to lower income people, there seems to be no tax relief. And there's a big question as to whether these tax cuts are actually going to boost. It may boost some consumption. It depends on what people do with the tax cuts. Do they save it to help with debt repayment? Do they actually spend it? And if they spend it, where does that spending go? And how long is that impact? Is that just a sugar hit, or is that more of a sustained boost to economic growth? They are some factors to be sorted out. But the other thing I think is important is that if they do cut taxes, we're just going to exacerbate the deficit, which means that we're going to roll out more bonds, and those bonds have to be kept at a particular interest rate, which means that there's more money printing, more QE from the RBA, and that's just going to keep the inflation merry-go-round going even further with larger deficits. So, the budget repair question of getting the budget deficit as close to zero as possible, I think is paramount. But as we go forward in an election year, it's all about winning re-election, and they've got to just keep people in the illusion that everything is buoyant up until when Australians go to the polls.
Mm-hmm. And just worth recalling that both in the US and in the UK, they're proposing to put taxes up, particularly corporate taxes, to try and cover some of the costs of the packages that they're putting out at the moment, right? So at some point, there's going to be a conversation to be had about taxes going the other way rather than reducing, right? And the second point which is really important, is that there is a disconnect between Treasury and the Reserve Bank about at what stage you're going to start seeing incomes rise and unemployment settle, right? Treasury thinks that once you get an unemployment rate to 4 something, you actually should start then trying to budget repair, whereas the Reserve Bank is saying, no, you should get unemployment down to a 3 something before you start seeing any income growth, and then you could start. So there's a fundamental disconnect between those two entities as to where does the strategy point come in.
Yep. Well, I'm going to be very I'll be looking very closely at the upcoming budget in about a month's time to see what are the forecasts, because typically I read the forecast and I just don't believe the forecast, and Treasury has had a woeful experience in the last decade of forecasting both economic growth but also tax revenue, and it'll be interesting to sort of look at what the numbers were given last year and what the revised numbers are looking in terms of this year when they release them. Now, so we're talking about the macroeconomic impacts. So my view, in summary, is stagflation is going to increase in terms of the effect. So I haven't walked away from my position in terms of before. Martin, if you wish to express a different view, happy for you to do that.
Well, I just don't believe we're going to see any wages growth. So therefore, that critical inflationary impetus isn't going to be there. So we might get some inflationary pressures from some categories, for example, food and those sorts of things. I still think that we're going to wobble sideways rather than see massive amounts of it. And as you said earlier on, the way that inflation is being reported is actually completely wrong anyway, because it doesn't include house prices, etc., etc. So the official numbers might well be quite low. Experience on the ground might be a bit different, but no wages growth for at least 4 years is what the Reserve Bank's saying.
We'll have to see what happens on wages, particularly because we've got restrained immigration.
Yep.
So that could have some sort of impact. We'll have to see how that happens. But
although, of course, Morrison's saying he'd like to get migration happening quickly.
He may say that, but given that we're just talking about a delay in the vaccine rollout, that hope may take them a little bit more time.
Yep.
Now, in terms of the regional or microeconomic impact, all I'll say is that certain sectors are going to be hit harder more than others. So airlines, hotels, tourists, entertainment, arts, they're the sort of ones that are top of mind for me. Particular areas of the country are going to be feeling it more so than others. Yep. Gold Coast, northern Queensland like Cairns, and you've got a few other tourist spots that are going to have a disproportionate impact. Byron Bay potentially, given that they get a lot of tourism there. So they're my broad microeconomic impact situation. And I think if people are watching this show and you are living in one of these micro hotspots, your financial approach to the next 6 months may be different to someone, say, in one of the capital cities where the impact will be less severe. So unless if you've got some specific comments, Martin.
Well, only to say that this is a real patchwork, right? So I go down to postcode levels and do all my analysis there, because there are such big differences with JobKeeper, JobSeeker, employment, mortgage stress, affordability of houses, wherever you look, right? But generally, it's clear to me that where the reliance has been on international travel and visitors, they are really against it. So some of those North Queensland areas would be in that category. We're also seeing pockets of difficulty elsewhere across the country as well. And even in the West, where, of course, the West is claiming to be booming, I'm still seeing massive pockets of difficulty there. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, and I'll be watching very closely. I'll also be watching for those correlations at a regional level with SME failures, because I know that there are high numbers of SMEs in some of these locations that are really hanging on by their fingernails. And my suspicion is that some of them will actually give up. Once you get through Easter, you've then got months and months and months before you have a chance really to sort of get another round of tourism or whatever. A lot of people will find that, I think, too hard. So watch this space.
So now, I have had some inquiries, Martin, of certain people who are looking to enter the property market, and they're very specifically focused on particular areas. So is it fair to say that while there are booming house prices, particularly in some of the capital cities, because of all the factors we just outlined, is it fair to say that in some of these hotspots which are going to be severely impacted, even on houses, putting apartments aside, we could see either house prices going sideways or they may even fall if the unemployment and business failure situation was to be exacerbated.
Well, it's very interesting. Cairns is a good example of that, right? So, again, I've been talking to people on the ground there in Cairns, and prices really are hard doing anything, even house prices in Cairns, in and around that area, right? Compare that with Sunshine Coast or Gold Coast, closer to Brisbane, where things are actually quite buoyant in the housing market, right? And in fact, Sunshine Beach on the Sunshine Coast is actually probably one of the most buoyant property markets, up more than 20% in a year for houses, right? Mm-hmm. None of that up north, up around Cairns, none of that. So again, you have to go granular, you have to really look at in detail. And I do think that we're going to see some property areas where in fact prices are going to go sideways or south, others where they're going to continue up for a bit.
Yeah. Now, my concluding thought is, so when we think about the title of the show of this worsening horror nightmare, so when I take a step back, Martin, and think, well, what are we doing as a country? We have the biggest debt bubble in the history of the country. At the same time, we've got the biggest debt bubble in the history of the world, and we over-exaggerated to a virus, in my view, and we implemented the biggest stimulus package, and now we've withdrawn it. But what are we hoping to achieve here? We're hoping that more debt is going to solve more debt. So we've basically given households all the incentives to borrow to the hilt. So to be honest, before COVID-19, I think you and I have had some conversations today. We thought at that point, before, say in 2019, we thought households had already borrowed to the hilt. Well, now we know that if borrowing power is increased by 15 to 20%, a lot of households are now borrowing to the ultimate hilt. Yep. And that obviously is creating a short-term amount of demand. Those households will struggle to pay that debt back, particularly if economic circumstances change. So I think they've basically run themselves into a dead-end street with no hope of recovery. So that's one. And obviously the other solving debt problem is the ever accumulation of public sector debt to try to keep this show on the road. And it's not just the federal government, but I think a couple of months ago, I looked at some of the state government positions, and if you look at the projections over the next 4 years from 2020 to 2024, and you added up all the states and territories and you exclude the federal government, that's an extra $500 billion just at the state territory level alone, putting the federal government on top. So we have a problem with debt. We've exacerbated that problem with debt. It's getting bigger, and as it's getting bigger, people's living standards are going further down because it's more costly to get a house, to raise a family, to pay for all the essentials. And when it comes to public policy, those who are in charge can't go back because while they are seeking in some way to go back on the spending, they're trying to basically offset that cut in spending by cutting taxes and keeping the federal deficit effectively around the same sort of numbers. But when it comes to the RBA, you can't raise rates because more and more people are in debt, and the governments are more in debt. But also separate to rates, yield curve control, or in terms of quantitative easing, or or some of these other measures that they have. If you start to remove these policies around the bonds, well, what will happen is that because these bonds have been bought at an elevated price, the bonds will fall in price, the yields on the bonds will go higher, and those costs, independent of short-term rates, will start to feed into the economy, and that will be a drag on economic growth, and you see a lot of households struggle with variable interest rates going up. So if the name of the game is to avoid a deflationary depression, the Harry Dent scenario, they have pushed us further into a corner that we can never come back from. And we haven't use the H word yet, hyperinflation. I'm not necessarily saying we're heading towards hyperinflation, but if I've read a number of books about Germany in 1923, and to a large extent it looks like we are repeating all the same mistakes that the Germans did going into 1923, and ultimately the end consequence of ever more money printing, ever more debt, ever more federal government and state government deficits. It is a big inflationary problem, and obviously the Dent thesis is based on the debt shrinking, and they're doing everything they can to stop that shrinking. And therefore, I think my position that we're seeing exacerbated or accelerated stagflation going forward, it's still a reasonable thesis to put forward.
Right, and it's just worth adding one other perspective, an international perspective here. The IMF is about to announce or discuss an increase in what's called the special drawing rights. So effectively that's money which is created out of fiat, right, which is given to the IMF, which the IMF can then pass on to economies around the world to bolster the countries' balance sheets, right? This is a whole new flow of effectively more fiat. So in other words, more stimulus. So not only are Federal Reserves in the US and Reserve Bank here doing it and the government's doing it, but now the IMF's at it too. So wherever you look, the solution is to create more of this stuff without actually having an exit strategy. That is a disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah, and that is a disaster. And I think more investors, both retail and institutional, are waking up to this problem in the monetary system. And obviously in our past few shows about silver and our commentary about gold and RBA and all of that sort of stuff over the last few years, that I think is going to be a bigger theme going forward, given what you just said, both on the domestic as well as the international situation.
Yeah, we are looking at a very steep hill, and unfortunately it's looked like it's uphill rather than downhill from this point onwards.
That's right.
John, I appreciate your time today. Very important show, and we'll continue to update the audience with regard to the economic outlook as things move forward.
Absolutely.
Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.